This is part 1 of 4 on Chapter 7, Microbial Nutrition, Ecology, and Growth. In this chapter, we're going to be looking at 5 different topics. So we're going to start off with microbial nutrition. We'll talk about transport mechanisms in and out of cells, environmental factors that can influence microbial growth, ecological associations between microbes and other organisms, and then looking at the study of microbial growth at the very end, so looking at growth curves. Starting off with nutrition, so all living things need a source of nutrition or a source of energy in order to be living, so in order to grow, to reproduce, to move, to do all those different activities. So nutrition is just the process by which chemical substances or nutrients are acquired from the environment and used in cellular activities. If we look at the energy cycle in the biosphere, which is shown in the image on this slide, we'll start at the very top. All living things need organic molecules and oxygen at the top. They take these organic molecules in food plus oxygen and they go through a process called cellular respiration. Out of cellular respiration, they produce energy intermediates, or ATP. That ATP is used for lots of different types of cellular activities. Besides ATP, cellular respiration also produces carbon dioxide and water as a byproduct. And that's shown at the very bottom of this cycle on the slide. This carbon dioxide and water is used in a process called photosynthesis. So we take carbon dioxide and water, we add in sunlight energy, they go through photosynthesis. Out of photosynthesis we get organic molecules and oxygen. So you can see we have this energy cycle where it goes back and forth, and the two big metabolic processes that occur are cellular respiration and photosynthesis up here. So some nutrients are called essential nutrients. These are nutrients that must be provided to an organism. The organism cannot make their own. They have to get it from their environment, from eating other organisms, or in some way. So there's 2 categories of essential nutrients. There's the macronutrients. These are required in large quantities, so macro means large. And they play really, really important roles or principal roles in cell structure and metabolism. Macronutrients include the proteins, the carbohydrates, and the lipids. So those 3 macromolecules that we looked at way back in chapter 3. The other type of essential nutrients are the micronutrients, or they're called trace elements. So micro means small, so these are required in very small amounts. That doesn't mean that they're not important, it's just that we need them in smaller amounts. So these micronutrients are involved in enzyme function and they help maintain protein structure. So examples of micronutrients include the minerals and vitamins, so manganese, zinc, and nickel will be these micronutrients or trace minerals. Besides being classified based on a macronutrient or micronutrient, we can also classify nutrients based on if they're organic or inorganic. So organic nutrients, remember organic, think of organic chemistry, molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen atoms. They're usually produced by living things. So these are going to include our 4 macromolecules, or carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. The other type of nutrients, they can be inorganic nutrients. So these are atoms or molecules that contain a combination of atoms other than carbon or hydrogen. So inorganic chemistry. So these are all the metals and their salts, gases, water, for example. Nutrients, they can be macronutrients and inorganic, like water. We need lots of water. It's an inorganic molecule. You can also have micronutrients that are inorganic, so the metals and their salts are an example of this. So you can have combinations of these different terms. So if we look at chemical analysis of cell contents, cells are 70% water, they have lots of proteins, and then if you look at the elements that make up cells, 96% of cells are composed of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. Then we also have phosphorus, sulfur, and nitrogen. In order to get all of the elements needed to create all of the macromolecules, living things need to have sources of these essential nutrients. So there's two different ways organisms can get these essential nutrients. They can be heterotrophs, where they have to get their carbon from an organic form. So that means they have to eat other living organisms, or they have to pick up something that's made by another living organism. And these include the proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, and nucleic acids. So heterotrophs, we're a good example of a heterotroph. We have to eat other organisms or products from other organisms to get our nutrients. The other way that organisms can get their essential nutrients is by being autotrophs. These are when organisms, instead of using an organic source of carbon, so carbon coming from a living thing, their carbon comes from carbon dioxide. So these are organisms that use carbon dioxide as their carbon source. Autotrophs, I think, are pretty cool because they're not nutritionally dependent on other living things. All they need is carbon dioxide, which is in the air, and then they need a source of energy, and then they can make their own food. So that's pretty cool. Some essential nutrients are called growth factors. Growth factors have to be provided as a nutrient. So the organism has to get it from their food, or they have to get it from some other source. Some of these growth factors are essential amino acids. For example, humans, we have 9 amino acids that we have to get from our diet. We can't make them ourselves, so those are essential. We also need to consume different types of vitamins that we can't produce on our own, such as vitamin C, for example. So you need to eat citrus fruit to get the vitamin C. If you don't get enough vitamin C, you end up having scurvy. So besides these different types of carbon source, so you can be a heterotroph where you have organic carbon source, or you can be an autotroph where your carbon source can be inorganic, like carbon dioxide. Besides getting carbon, you need to get an energy source. And there's 2 different types of energy. You can be a chemotroph. This is where you get energy from chemical compounds. So from eating food, you break it down, you get energy from that. You also have phototrophs, where they get energy through photosynthesis from the sun or from breaking down other types of molecules. So these, the carbon source and the energy source, you can combine them together. So you can have, for example, we have photoautotrophs. So photo, they use sunlight, they use photosynthesis. Auto, they make their own food. They can use carbon dioxide to get their carbon. So again, photoautotroph, using sunlight, their carbon source is carbon dioxide. These organisms include algae, plants, and cyanobacteria. That one we're pretty familiar with. It's just photosynthetic organisms. You can also have chemoautotrophs. So instead of getting energy from sunlight, they get energy from breaking down chemicals. And then they use that energy to make their own food. So these are very rare. Only certain types of bacteria, such as methanogens, so bacteria that live in methane swamps, or bacteria that live really deep sea vents way down in the ocean. So autotrophs and their energy sources. So photoautotrophs, you can have oxygenetic photosynthesis. This is where you have carbon dioxide, water, you get energy from the sun, and you produce oxygen as a byproduct. Other types of photosynthesis, besides producing oxygen as a byproduct, you can have anoxygenic photosynthesis. This is where you get sulfur compounds that are produced instead of oxygen. But again, they're still photoautotrophs, so they use sunlight and they use carbon dioxide to create their own food. Whereas the chemoautotrophs, they survive totally on inorganic substances. So chemoautotrophs do not rely on living things at all. They don't rely on sunlight, they don't rely on other living things. So that's a pretty cool thing to think about. So again, these include the methanogens. So they're a chemoautotroph. They produce methane gas, that's why they're called methanogens, under anaerobic conditions, so conditions where oxygen is not available. So they use a hydrogen to get their energy, and then carbon dioxide as their carbon source. They use that to make methane gas and water, and they can survive off of that. So pretty cool stuff for that one, but they're very rare. The other types, so we can also have chemoheterotrophs. These are like us, for example, animals. So chemoheterotrophs, they need, their energy source comes from breaking down molecules. And they're heterotrophs, so they have to get their carbon from an organic source. And there's different types. So chemoheterotrophs, you can, protozoans, fungi, a lot of bacteria, animals fit under this category. Humans fit under this category. Under chemoheterotrophs, we have a few specializations. So a saprobe, these are fungi and bacteria. They decompose dead organisms instead of eating live ones or products from live organisms. You can also have parasites. These are organisms that parasitize a living host. So they cause harm, usually, or they can cause disease in the host. So they utilize tissue, they can steal food from the host, and these include lots of different parasites, including pathogens, which can be bacteria that cause disease, fungi, protozoans, and also some animals. So some of the worms, like the ringworms and the tapeworms, fit into this parasite category. So chemoheterotrophs are pretty common. You can also have photoheterotrophs, so they have to get their energy from sunlight, and they have to get their carbon from an organic source. And this is kind of rare, so there's purple and green photosynthetic bacteria that fit into the photoheterotroph. So like I was saying, most heterotrophs are chemoheterotrophs. That's the majority of organisms. They do what's called aerobic respiration or cellular respiration. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail of the cellular respiration, but basically they take glucose or they take food, and you take oxygen. That's why we breathe in oxygen. And you do this long process, and you get carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, and other organisms breathe out. We get water, and then we get ATP. ATP is the energy that the cell is going to use to do all of the metabolism, all those reactions in the cell. This picture on this slide, it shows this aerobic respiration. It has 4 steps, or 3 steps depending on the book that you look at. But it starts off with glycolysis. That makes 2 ATPs. The products of glycolysis, the pyruvate, goes into the prep reaction. That goes into the citric acid cycle, where you get a few more ATPs. And then you also have all of these energy intermediates that are being created during glycolysis in the citric acid cycle. And those are up at the top. They're the NADH and FADH2 in the orange box. These molecules, they hold energy for a very short amount of time. Then they take that energy into the electron transport chain, and that's where the majority of the ATP is produced. So you can see coming out the bottom, you have 34 ATP produced. So efficient cellular respiration, for every gram of glucose, or every molecule of glucose, you can get up to 38 ATP. Usually our cells are not that efficient, so we get around 30 to 34 out of cellular respiration for every glucose molecule. And then I talked about the special types of chemoheterotrophs. We have the saprobes. These are free-living microorganisms. They feed on organic detritus from dead organisms. So they feed on like dead tissue or waste. They're facultative parasites, or they can be opportunistic pathogens. So facultative parasites means that they can be parasites on living things, but they usually feed on dead things. Opportunistic pathogens, these are organisms that usually don't cause disease, but they will if given the opportunity to become a pathogen to cause the disease. So think of like the fungi. So usually fungi, they're pretty free living, but they can produce a disease. So think of like yeast infections is a good example. So we have yeast pretty much everywhere in our body, and when it grows too much, you get a yeast infection or a fungal infection. The other type of chemoheterotroph, the parasites, these are the ones that I was talking about. They derive nutrients from their host, they're pathogens, they cause disease. Some of the parasites are obligate parasites. Obligate means that they have to be parasites in order to live and to reproduce. So those are the two different types of chemoheterotrophs.